What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So, as some of you may know, I've been in the process of replaying the Fire Emblem Tellius Duology, which is comprised of Fire Emblem Path of Radiance for the Nintendo GameCube and Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn for the Nintendo Wii. I have finished now my second playthrough of both of these games on their hardest difficulties with some small caveats for each of them. For the purpose of this video, I will primarily be discussing Path of Radiance, introducing numerous elements that apply to both games, which will in turn allow me to, in the video on Radiant Dawn, jump right into the things that are distinct about it compared to Path of Radiance, as opposed to reintroducing many of the similarities. I think I'm going to save most, if not all, of the spoiler discussion for Radiant Dawn, since there will be some inherent spoilery kinds of things that would need to be discussed in regards to Path of Radiance especially. I would say that the draw, especially so with this first title, is more so in its storytelling, be it world building, character development, etc. So if you're the type of Fire Emblem player who is strictly there for the gameplay and you couldn't give two shits about story stuff, it might not strike you as being your favorite in the series, but I still think that it is well worth playing because of the high bar that it sets in terms of those narrative elements in a series that I would say more often than not isn't really known for its storytelling in this same way. Though I will say that there is a reason why the Fire Emblem titles that are more narrative focused tend to leave a lasting impression on players. I think that component is indicative of how storytelling can really enhance the overall experience of video games in general. As this is the first 3D entry in the Fire Emblem series, there are some noticeable concessions in terms of presentation, but at the same time, it's hard for me to hold it against the game too much. So for one, this game natively runs at a 4:3 aspect ratio, as with many GameCube games. So this is something that I'm used to from back in the day, but when I have an option to play in 16:9 widescreen, I would like to. And when it comes to emulating games on Dolphin, there are ways to play many games in the GameCube library in widescreen via gecko codes in particular. From what I was able to find online, there is not seemingly a 16:9 gecko code for the North American version of this game. However, I did find one for the PAL version of the game, and while it did in fact run in 16:9, it's definitely not a perfect solution. While it was nice to play the maps in particular in 16:9, I kind of wish there was a code that applied this aspect ratio strictly to the maps in order to avoid some of the issues in other circumstances. Most notably, the character portraits clip off the side of the screen during story moments, among some other small graphical issues that were a little distracting. Now, all that emulation specific stuff aside, Path of Radiance presents its story sequences in the typical visual novel style, but with more detailed and expressive portraits than what came before. The lack of full voice acting could leave something to be desired for some people, including myself to a certain degree, but if you consider what the quality of that VO would have been using the cutscenes as a reference point, I think that leaving the voice acting out was the right call for the time, even though I would bet it was more of a budgetary decision than a creative one. Speaking of the cutscenes, while they are sparsely sprinkled throughout the game, they are still much appreciated for moments that I don't think would have worked as well in the visual novel format and or with the relatively primitive 3D models that they use for gameplay purposes. As far as the music in Path of Radiance, it's one of those soundtracks that's weirdly hit or miss for me, particularly because certain instruments in certain tracks sound very apparently MIDI in a way that I find distracting and kind of unappealing, whereas a number of other tracks sound great despite this limitation. I would still say that I'm content with the way this game presents itself, even though as unrealistic as it may be at this point, I would love to see a high effort remaster someday to shore up some of these admittedly minor presentation shortcomings, in addition to potentially some gameplay systems things that I'll dig into in a bit. The world of Tellius is by far one of the most interesting and fleshed out across the entire series. While much of this world building is conveyed through the sheltered main character gets exposited to trope via the game's main protagonist Ike, it rarely if ever feels unnatural, and there are still plenty of aspects to the world building that even some of the most knowledgeable characters here have no wherewithal about. Since Path of Radiance is part one of a 2-game long narrative, the plot in this first title mostly revolves around introducing and establishing the various nations, races, characters, etc. And while these aspects are explored beyond just the surface level introductions, there are a number of loose ends purposefully left open for Radiant Dawn to tie together. And that's to say, despite how grand the conflict in Path of Radiance can feel at times, it is ultimately just the inciting incident for something much, much grander in the sequel. Now, that's not to say this game's story isn't satisfying in its own right, particularly when it comes to how it handles its characters. It does help that the cast is relatively smaller than some other titles in the series, allowing for pretty memorable introductions for most of them at the very least. Not every character is equally deep or interesting, but the game takes quite a bit of time establishing the initial roster of the Greil Mercenaries and what the dynamic is between all of them. And many of these dynamics aren't just surface level throwaway kinds of things, they actually have bearing on the plot in some cases, such as when Ike becomes commander of the company. And speaking of Ike, replaying this game made me appreciate him as a main lord even more than my first playthrough. Not only does he deal with positions of authority being foisted on him as he gradually proves himself time and again, but he does so as someone who led a very sheltered life in the countryside and thus has neither the tact nor patience to deal with the bureaucracy that comes from interacting with nobility. Ike's propensity to speak out of line nearly lands him in hot water many times throughout the game, with each time he does this leading to more and more self-awareness about his demeanor, to the point where he becomes much more willing to play along with his role as a leader, but still in a way that's on his own terms because you know he wouldn't have it any other way. One particular character I want to highlight that consistently shines a light on Ike's character flaws as he grows throughout the game is none other than Soren, a character who admittedly would be better discussed in the Radiant Dawn video, which I will, but also a character that I find quite fascinating in this game all the same. His whole tirade about war and blissful ignorance is one of the most memorable and one of my favorite parts of not just this game, but maybe even the whole series. In fact, Path of Radiance has quite a few memorable and poignant lines of dialogue that really struck me in the moment, so much so that I think the way this game was written, or more accurately, localized, is easily among the best in the series. I was seriously engrossed in this game's story and dialogue pretty much from start to finish. Now, I could go on and on about many other characters, including but not limited to Elincia, Rayson, and Jill, but perhaps more notably, a character that, once again, would be better off discussed in depth in the Radiant Dawn video, none other than the main antagonist of Path of Radiance, Mad King Ashnard. Ashnard is a character who is so one-dimensional and comically evil, to the point where the more you learn about him, the less and less redeemable he becomes, and yet, he remains compelling due to how easy he is to root against, coupled with a threatening screen presence, and the nature of his plan being more than just what it seems on the surface. As strong as the characterization is for a lot of these characters in the mandatory story sequences, there's even more to uncover about them through base conversations and supports. The base in the Tellius games is, as far as I'm concerned, between chapter unit management done right. It's not bloated with superfluous bullshit, and everything you can do feels meaningful enough to justify its presence. Firstly, there's the aforementioned base conversations, which can provide not only additional character interactions and world building tidbits, but also on occasion some pretty rare or powerful items. There's a shop with a rotating inventory, as well as the series introduction of the Forge, where you can pay to create weapons with modified stats. These weapons can be pretty expensive, but this game dumps gold on you like few others in the series, so in turn the limitation placed on forging is that you can only create one forged weapon per chapter. While Path of Radiance is not the first Fire Emblem title with a skill system, it is much more at the forefront here, with each unit having a capacity for skills and skills taking up varying amounts of said capacity. And while in this game specifically, skills that are removed from units disappear forever, this can free up room for additional skills acquired from scrolls, allowing some degree of build crafting by utilizing skills that synergize with one another. However, the particular limitations set in place here, I would argue, don't allow for as much experimentation as it might seem at first. Either you're using occult scrolls to acquire class-specific abilities, which will take up most if not all of your unit's skill capacity, or you're doing some kind of Vantage Wrath combo, and honestly that's really the most interesting it gets here in my opinion. Though admittedly it was quite fun to watch Mia tear shit up with that ladder combo plus Provoke. Radiant Dawn kind of expands and I would say refines this system in certain ways, primarily that skills that you can remove from units in that game turn into scrolls that can then be assigned to other units. Now there are some compromises in that certain skills can't be removed, but also some skills that units come with don't take up any capacity on them, but then if you remove them, they would then take up capacity on any other unit, in addition to certain skills being nerfed. But overall, I think that that game handles its skill system better and leads to something that is more flexible and I would say kind of interesting to play around with. But the real highlight of the Tellius Duology's gameplay systems is bonus EXP, or BEXP. BEXP is something that you earn after each chapter. Oftentimes the amount will be higher if you clear chapters in fewer turns or fulfill various side objectives, something that I would say is kind of hit or miss in this game. Like, you have a couple of chapters that incentivize stealth with big quotation marks around it, and some others where the juice isn't really worth the squeeze as far as the BEXP that you would get from fulfilling those extra objectives. I think that that Radiant Dawn handles its BEX incentives better. But as far as the use for bonus EXP, this is something that you can distribute to your units while at the base. In my experience, it's best used for topping off units that are close to a level up, and maybe even in some cases giving certain high growth units a head start. As with many Fire Emblem titles, but especially so here because of the flexibility of the bonus EXP system, you can kind of use whoever you want throughout the game. I also need to mention that promotion in the Tellius titles happens automatically when you reach level 21 of your base class, with the option to use a Master Seal anytime after level 10, as is the case in many other Fire Emblem titles. Here, I think it's okay to wait until that auto promotion for most units at least. In particular, ones that are going to see a lot of combat. I think for certain utility units like Mist, for instance, it can be worth it to use a Master Seal because of the benefits she gets from her promotion outside of combat utility. Last but not least, in terms of base management kinds of things, the support system returns from the GBA titles. What's nice about the Tellius games is it actually tells you the specific bonuses units are getting from their supports, but you still have that limitation where the extent by which these incidental characters are fleshed out is limited by how many support conversations a unit can complete in any given playthrough, which is 5, meaning that you can only max one support chain per run. I get that this allows for the paired endings to be more easily determined, but at the same time it's a little shitty in terms of filling out the support log because, okay, I got an A support between these two units and only up to B with another because that's all you can do, but then on the following playthrough, if I want to see the unit that I previously got to B ranks A support, then I have to spend essentially 3 of my 5 support conversations to get that previous run's B support to A, and then you're running into the same thing with a new unit now that you're getting to B. If anything, it would be nice if you could just max 2 of them, and maybe the paired endings are determined in some other way. I understand that from a gameplay standpoint, being able to max everyone's supports over the course of a given playthrough would be pretty broken. Maybe they could handle it sort of like a hybrid between this game and Radiant Dawn, where you can do as many conversations as possible, but you have to select a specific other unit to get the bonuses from. Like, there's a number of ways that you could balance things from a gameplay standpoint in terms of supports, while still allowing you to view these character interactions that I think are very important in a lot of cases. And with all of that said, despite there being a smaller amount of support conversations here compared to many of the later entries, there are quite a few that feel like they're kind of forcing 3 ranks out of these interactions as opposed to making the most of them. As with any Fire Emblem title, there are a number of great support conversations as well, and while I would like to explore them more in the context of the game itself, as opposed to looking them up on YouTube or viewing them in Radiant Dawn with 100% save file or something, I do feel like I'd have to really go out of my way to build up some of the more obscure pairings, especially because of how cracked the usual suspects in FE9's cast become, thanks to the relatively low difficulty ceiling, which can easily result in replays devolving into using those same units over and over and over again. So as I mentioned in the intro, I played Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn on their hardest difficulties, with some small caveats for each of them. The main caveat for Path of Radiance being that Maniac mode is exclusive to the Japanese version of this game, with the other versions adding in an easy mode below the Japanese version's easiest difficulty. And so while I did play on the hardest difficulty in the PAL version in this case, it is not technically the hardest that Path of Radiance can be if you play the English translation of the Japanese version. That said, literally everything I've heard about Japanese Maniac mode has been quite negative, even from many hardcore Fire Emblem diehards. I think really the only aspect of this game that provided what felt like a genuine challenge where I was on the edge of my seat and unsure if I was going to make it through was the final boss, which if you play this game on hard mode, it is quite distinct from the other difficulties and even many other Fire Emblem titles. It's just one of those things that kind of caught me off guard in relation to what the game had provided in terms of challenge prior. I found the most common downside this led to was complacency on my part, leading to careless mistakes. Now granted, those careless mistakes really weren't punished that badly in most cases, although there were a few maps towards the beginning of the game that I did reset a few times, but regardless of that, this became pretty much a non-issue past the early game. And a lot of this comes down to, as I mentioned before, the best units in this game just won't die easily and can steamroll entire squads of enemies if you equip them with even decent weapons and skills. Now this can be quite entertaining to witness, however, the pace of the battles is so horrendously slow, which dulls the appeal of this style of play over time. runtime. And look, it's not like this game's runtime is egregiously long compared to other Fire Emblem titles or anything. I mean, it took me around 40 hours-ish when all was said and done, maybe a little bit more if you consider those few resets early on, but consider that this was with battle animations turned off, barring the first couple of chapters. There are still map animations that, while faster, are still pretty slow, and it just really sucks knowing that a good chunk of this game's runtime is watching the enemy phase play out at the speed of fucking molasses. Now look, as with any game that you're emulating from this era prior, there are speed up options for Dolphin, but I would really just prefer not to have to resort to something like that as a way to excuse an aspect to this game that absolutely does drag it down from a gameplay standpoint. And it's quite frustrating because it drags this game from a gameplay front in a way that is so easily solvable just by having these animations not be so goddamn slow, and maybe even, as in Radiant Dawn, having the option to just turn off all animations, including the ones on the map. This is something that is somewhat remedied in Radiant Dawn. Not only are the full battle animations paced better, you can kind of skip through certain aspects of them, particularly at the end. They're also animated much more interesting, so I find that it's easier to justify because of that cool factor, in addition to, as I mentioned, being able to just turn all animations off outright if you want to play that way. However, I do think something is lost when having to resort to that. It's, as I mentioned in the past with many turn-based games, where it is definitely possible to make animations that are flashy and compelling, but move along at a pace that doesn't drag. One small thing in terms of battle preparation, I often found myself looking up the following chapter's deployment limit so that I could avoid having to go back to the base to buy something that it turns out I needed. Of course, you can return to the base at no cost from that deployment screen, but at that point, why not just give the player access to everything the base can do from the preparation screen? It's definitely a nitpick, but it's a really strange thing that kind of bothered me after a while. There's a couple of small things I don't really want to dig into, but should mention, being Lagoo's units, which rely on a gauge filling up to allow them to transform and actually participate in combat. It's kind of a clunky system, but it can be worth it to use them in certain cases. You have the order and direct commands via Ike, the former of which I have no idea why you would use, and the latter of which giving you some level of control over guest units that you can't directly control like the rest of your army. Rescue dropping and Kanto are back, but in terms of Kanto, aka mounted units being able to move again after taking certain actions, this game and Radiant Dawn have what is called Super Kanto, which allows for your mounted or flying units to move after literally any action, including combat. This is a very powerful thing and leads to those types of units being arguably overpowered, especially in this game. But at the same time, it's one of those things that is kind of appreciated in certain circumstances, and similar to rescue dropping in the GBA games, it's one of those systems that kind of keeps the rest of the systems intact to a certain extent. Although Radiant Dawn does nerf mounted and flying units in certain ways, which I'll dig into in the Radiant Dawn video. Going back to the battle animation thing, there's no combat forecast when animations are playing out. Not that you're probably going to want to leave them on anyway, as I went into, but it's one of those weird omissions that Radiant Dawn brings back. Of course, any given round of combat is going to be what it's going to be, but it's nice to know the odds when you're getting attacked on enemy phase. You've got Biorhythm, which is a system that I think was intended to de-incentivize spamming the same units over and over again, kind of like a very light version of Thracia 776's fatigue system, but the difference in biorhythm levels is honestly pretty negligible from what I can tell, to the point where I basically paid it no mind. How strong your units are in relation to enemy units often results in the best choice being just doubling down on your strongest units as opposed to diversifying who you deploy, like I think Biorhythm was trying to incentivize. But on the other hand, it does allow you to pick and choose who you invest in more easily, but in turn results in a game that feels kind of incongruent with the typical permadeath ethos of the series, especially to this point. There are transfer bonuses for units that are at max level and have capped stats, and this grants those units in Radiant Dawn +2 to any stat that they have capped in Path of Radiance, but then it's kind of equally weird that the units that died in your Path of Radiance playthrough don't stay dead in Radiant Dawn. Certain narrative reasonings for that, sure, because when certain characters get reintroduced, it would just be like, well, what do you have there instead? It's one of those things that I think could have been more heavily considered. I mean, the ease of difficulty in Path of Radiance leads to a game where you're probably not going to lose very many units anyway, but it's also kind of a game that I think you could argue for having a casual mode and then having Radiant Dawn be kind of where permadeath is introduced in the duology, and functionally it kind of is like that, as I was saying, but not literally. So it's just one of those things that's a little strange, but there's more than a few strange aspects to Radiant Dawn, which I'm interested to discuss at a later date. Now, in conclusion, as far as my thoughts on Path of Radiance in particular, this game has easily one of the most compelling narratives in the series, with gameplay systems that, despite my criticisms, strike a good balance between traditional and modern Fire Emblem at this point. It's just that this game unfortunately suffers from how slowly its core gameplay plays out, coupled with how little of a fight it puts up throughout its not unusual but still substantial runtime for this series. Now, with all that said, I think it is absolutely a game game that you should play if you haven't. It is still, in my opinion, one of the best games in the series, but I think any given person's propensity to replay it, at least frequently, will vary depending on how much you value re-experiencing this story and this world as a preface to the second half of this duology, Radiant Dawn. If there's anything you'd like for me to incorporate in that video that I may have brushed over here, let me know in the comments. There is quite a bit that I do plan to cover, but both of these games combined are pretty massive, and so I'm trying to do my best to recall and explain all of the various elements to these titles as best I can. Before I sign off, I do of course want to thank my channel members and shout out Space Cowboy EXE at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe of course if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.